10 secrets of the USS Voyager you need to know. Number 10, the Aero Shuttle. Gonna start here with the exact same place I started for the Enterprise D. Do you remember when you watched Insurrection you thought, oh, a captain's yacht, a mini ship built into the ship, wouldn't that be a great idea for a long-running television series? Well, not only was the captain's yacht a part of the Enterprise D, but Voyager actually had one of these, a really cool version of these, built into the bottom of its hull. It was called the Aero Shuttle. It was there. They wrote about it, they talked about it, they even filmed concept shots for it, but you never saw it on the show. It's actually insane, this, because of all the shuttlecraft scenes we got, all the shuttlecrafts we saw get destroyed, then the whole subplot of the Delta Flyer, them designing this separate ship and doing all of that, when this was literally there, this gorgeous little mini craft was actually there the entire time. It's just bizarre. And there shouldn't have even been any specific production reasons that stopped them doing it, because it was designed to look like the front of a Danube-class runabout from Deep Space Nine, thus meaning they could just reuse the sets they used for those. It was there, it was built, it was designed, it was rendered in lovely VFX. They had the props, they had the sets, and they just didn't use it. Number 9, the Intrepid class. Now, despite the USS Intrepid getting a mention in Star Trek Voyager, Voyager itself was the first Intrepid-class vessel we ever saw, and one of only 2 that ever made it into Star Trek. But as well as that, though, there was, and I absolutely cannot believe I'm going to attempt to do this sentence without a visual aid, the USS Bellerophon from the Deep Space Nine episode Inter Arma Emen Silent Leges. Inter Arma Emet Leges Silent. Inter Arma, the one where Bashir in Section 31 and the Romulans. Anyway, yes, that episode did completely repurpose all of Voyager's sets to have Bashir whisked away from the station on a vessel. It was just Voyager, even though it was meant to be a different Intrepid-class ship. It even had Neelix's kitchen. Just take that out. Now, while Voyager didn't make it into any other Star Trek series, it was weirdly in the trailer for Star Trek First Contact firing on a Borg cube. Now, these were not scenes that were used in any other element of Voyager. They were pretty much constructed entirely for this trailer because apparently at the time they hadn't finished the VFX works for First Contact, so just threw that in. Just gonna hold my hand up here. Little, tiny, juvenile, young me saw that and thought Voyager was in First Contact and got really bummed out when Voyager wasn't in First Contact. Number 8, the environmentally friendly warp drive. Alright, this is one of my absolute favourite things about both the design of this ship and the lore of Star Trek as a whole. Didn't you think it was cool when Voyager's warp nacelles would go dunk and then it would go into warp speed? That wasn't just a weird design choice. In the Star Trek The Next Generation episode Forces of Nature, it is revealed that use of warp travel is destroying the fabric of space-time, so Starfleet puts a limit on ever going above warp 5 because they're trying to save the galaxy, because you would. But the thing is, despite mentioning these warp speed limits in 2 subsequent episodes, it kind of just got dropped at a random point in time and you never heard about them again. That is because, even though they didn't explore this in the show, developments were made, strides were made forward in more environmentally friendly warp drives. And these variable geometry pylons were supposed to be the workaround for that. Basically, the writers realized that they had written themselves into a stupid corner. Nobody can go above warp 5, and we're going to have a starship stranded on the other side of the galaxy. Goodoy, that's not going to work. So they came up with this idea that they would have a more environmentally friendly warp drive, something to do with how the warp bubble wraps around the ship. Basically, it just doesn't destroy space as it travels through it. There's a reason for it. Number 7, the holodecks are independent. Now, this is a plot contrivance, if I've ever heard of a plot contrivance, and point of order, being a big old Star Trek fan, I've heard lots of plot contrivances, but Voyager's holodecks were entirely separate from the rest of the ship. They had their own power source. Yet, for reasons known only to the writers, they decided to make the ship run on one source of power, but the holodecks to run on another. So even if primary and secondary systems were to fail and they were unable to reroute power through the auxiliary manifolds, etc., etc., the crew could still go and play Captain Planet or have a drink at that nice French restaurant they liked, or make out with cows in Fairhaven, which happened. Actually, I'm saying that, I know exactly why they did this. It was so they could have crises happening on the ship while people were in the holodecks completely unaware of it. There are more logical ways to do that, but this is what they went with. Number 6, Voyager has a brain. Now again, this was something that was only mentioned in passing in 1 or 2 episodes, which should have been a far bigger element of the narrative. Starfleet vessels had been for many, many years equipped with isolinear circuitry, which was an incredibly advanced way of circuits linking to each other and information being passed in. It's basically kind of the same thing we have with computer chips now, but just really good computer chips. However, the thing about computer chips is they are designed to replicate what goes on in the human brain with synapses firing and whatnot, but they are of course not as good as the human brain because the human brain is an organ designed to do that and works on the molecular level. And so in what was a pretty natural evolution in technology, they decided to make this circuitry run like an organic life form. Thus they had these bio-neural gel packs which were responsible for transferring data across the ship and could do it, in theory, as quick as a brain could. Now, of course, the only problem with that is, what is the problem with a brain compared to a computer full of chips? You can get headaches and your brain can break down, and sometimes you can just be staring at the same screen for too long and it can hurt. So Voyager had loads and loads of problems with its computer getting sick. So over the course of the show, these gel packs, they got a virus, they got poisoned, and my personal favourite, they got a fever one time, so they had to heat Voyager up to effectively boil it off. Technology. Number 5, Voyager of Borg. Yes, by the time Voyager returned to the Alpha Quadrant, it was, yes, still the same robust vessel Starfleet had sent off into the Badlands that time, but it also came back very much a product of the Delta Quadrant because it was, in large parts, actually Borg. In Scorpion Part 2, when 7 of 9 comes aboard, she basically installs loads of Borg augments to the inside and the outside of the ship to make it more efficient. Now, of course, the crew do attempt to get rid of all that once they've got rid of all the Borg, -7, but the problem with Borg stuff is the Borg stuff's really good. Upon discovering that a lot of the ship's components were actually working slightly better with the Borg components still installed, Janeway ordered that they be left in place. B'Elanna Torres, she hated this. She would repeatedly refer to these changes as Borg garbage, but then of course when they went to build the Delta Flyer, what did they use? Largely Borg components. And just not for me to tell Captain Janeway how to run her ship. I have zero track record of ever returning something from the other side of the galaxy, but it was just me, given that Borg stuff replicates and takes over your face and bursts out your skin, I'd have got rid of all that. Just me. Number 4, unlimited limited supplies. Alright, here's a good stat list. In Star Trek Voyager, they established they had only 38 photon torpedoes to last until they got back to the Alpha Quadrant. How many photon torpedoes, though, do you think they fired across those 7 seasons? Anyone? Any guesses? Anybody? It's an empty flat. The answer is 85. Now, alright, yes, you're sitting there going, Adam, resupplying does exist in this galaxy, in this far-flung future. Yes, I know, I'm just talking about the fact they said they had that many, they never visibly showed us restocking any of them or finding ways to create more, and yet they fired nearly 3 times what they had. Again, not my place to tell someone how to write a show, but I would have addressed that, personally. And also across those 7 seasons, 10 different shuttlecraft were destroyed, as well as 15 others either being mentioned or damaged or just present, so that's at least 25 shuttlecraft Voyager had. It's a small ship, I don't know where they put those. Again, not to be that guy, but even little tiny Star Trek nerd me, when first watching the episode about the Delta Flyer, sat there and said out loud at the screen, but you've got loads of shuttlecraft, because I've always been unbearable. Number 3, 2-ish warp cores. Twice on Star Trek Voyager, the warp core was either ejected or stolen or something, and it left the ship dead in space, which is weird because they had a second warp core. According to this cutaway graphic, which was shown several million times during the course of the show, there is, of course, the primary warp core that's in engineering, but also further forward behind the deflector dish, this warp core, which is a warp core, and thus would have worked like a warp core. If you're still not convinced, this is the ejection port that we see the warp core leave the ship through, and this is the second port for the second warp core, because there was 2. Now yes, again, alright, if I was trying to get a crew all the way home from the other side of the galaxy, and my primary warp core was stolen or damaged or nicked, or just whatever, I probably wouldn't want to just leave it floating around in space. I probably would make the effort to go back and get it, but when I've got another one, I would use it instead of just floating there like an idiot. Number 2, the engines could not handle the journey. Alright, so you are a Star Trek Voyager fan, you are aware that in the first episode they enter the Badlands, the caretaker flings them all the way across the galaxy, and they work out it is going to take 75 years to get home. Not true. It's 75 years to get home if from day 1 they went at maximum warp in a straight line all the way back to the Alpha Quadrant without ever stopping. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen any episodes of Star Trek Voyager, but they stop a lot. They explore interesting space phenomena, they talk to new species, they end up getting into fights, they have their own adventures, they have their own dramas, their own romances, everything. In fact, very little of the series Star Trek Voyager is spent doing any actual voyaging. Now, yes, fair enough, the ship is probably not capable of sustaining maximum warp for nearly 8 decades, but according to the show's producers, it was realistically going to take them between 2 and 400 years to get back to the Beta Quadrant. Not even all the way back to Earth, just back into friendly space. That is, let's see, a lot of episodes. Number 1, Voyager is the Enterprise. Well, I mean, it's not, obviously it's not it's Voyager, it's not the Enterprise, but you know how there's a reality away from the show in which sets have to be made and things have to be built and whatnot. Well, Voyager is technically, in that regard, the Enterprise. Not the one that's full of cat, though. Basically, Star Trek The Next Generation went off the air in 1994, and Star Trek Voyager began in 1995. Thus, Paramount found themselves with a load of Star Trek sets that weren't being used, and now had a big need for brand new Star Trek sets. Thus, they got their repurposing hats on and did some work. Now, the bridge of the Enterprise D, that was destroyed completely, and the bridge for Voyager was created on the same set. They share no similarities, they were built from the ground up. However, sickbay, the transporter rooms, the crew quarters, and all the corridors, whilst being given a major facelift, were just the exact same sets redressed. And so too was engineering, although that had a major facelift. They added an entire second floor. They brought in that, like the cell area where Deanna Troi tried to fling herself that time. They built that into Voyager's engine room. They made it look completely different, but it was the same set. This is my absolute favourite one, by the way. Those windows that Janeway spent so much time fixing all the ship's problems by just staring out of them. 10 forwards windows flipped upside down. Yep. And as much as the Lord giveth, the Lord also taketh away, because loads of the sets used in Star Trek Insurrection and Star Trek Nemesis were repurposed from Voyager. In fact, in First Contact, one of those best scenes where Robert Picardo is utilised as a doorstop, not a doctor, it's literally Voyager's sickbay. Is there an entire list to be done on Star Trek sets that were actually other Star Trek sets? Let me know in the comments.
Rest in peace, USS Shenzhou NCC 1227. Now let's analyse the crap out of you. Number 10, Old Reliantable. One of the lasting contributions that initial Star Trek Discovery showrunner Brian Fuller had was via the Shenzhou, he wanted to create something that would tie into Star Trek's aesthetic past, but while still progressing toward the future. At Fuller's request, the design team used the USS Reliant from Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan as a jumping off point when designing the Shenzhou. He wanted audiences to get that feeling that they've seen ships like this in the past. According to Fuller, we wanted the Shenzhou to be a much more traditional design, so that when you got to the Discovery and it looked different, you wondered why it was so different. However, there was another reason Fuller wanted to invoke the Wrath of Khan in this Starfleet design as well. The Reliant has a wonderful history of minority representation. We thought it would be a nice nod to echo its design with the Shenzhou because we wanted to give it a context that non-white Star Trek fans might appreciate. For Star Trek Discovery, the Shenzhou would be a step toward additional representation in Star Trek, both in the name of the ship itself and in her captain, Captain Philippa Georgiou. I wanted an Asian female captain. Calling the ship the Shenzhou after the Chinese space station felt like a wonderful way of acknowledging the scientific achievement of the Chinese community. Number 9, the Upside Down. As the rest of the art department under Mark Worthington worked on the Discovery itself, veteran Trek designer John Eaves worked with the jumping off point that the Reliant was to be used as something of an inspiration to both root and expand on the fact that the Zhenzhou has its place in Star Trek aesthetic history. Not only that, but he wanted the look of it to establish both where it came in the lineage and in the timeline of Star Trek itself. According to Eves, you'll see some elements of the NX-01 from the past, you'll see some elements of the Reliant from what's to come. I felt it was important to try and tie these time frames together in detailed form to put the ship into context. Eves produced dozens of sketches of the Zhenzhou, adapting it, switching it, changing it. However, with most of them having the warp nacelles on top at this point. When Brian Fuller and Mark Worthington both departed the series, only then was Eves able to pin down the final look of the Zhenzhou and flip it upside down. Todd Cherniawski was the one that finally gave good direction on it. I did one sketch he liked and we flipped it over and then angled the nacelles. Number 8. The 50s. 2250s. A huge aviation history buff, John Eves took inspiration not simply from Star Trek ships, but from aircraft from real-world history as well. According to Eves, production designer Todd Cherniawski, he gave the idea of incorporating elements of the old B-plane from history into the Zhenzhou, which goes a little way toward explaining the unique secondary hull design on the ship. Also, according to Eves, I thought about something that Tony Moore at Edwards Air Force Base told me about, which was blended body aircraft, where everything smoothly transitions into itself, so the hull blends into the wings and so forth. I thought I'd try to do the same thing, so my hull blended with the saucer, and that ended up being a nice idea that the producers really responded to. The design of the Zhenzhou also mimicked vintage aircraft by the inclusion of various aerodynamic fins along the hull and nacelles. This was directly inspired by the 1950s Cold War era Lockheed F-104 Starfighter. A bank of lights to illustrate the ship's registry was also borrowed directly from 1940s aircraft carriers. This kind of primitive addition was added to all of Discovery's pre-TOS ships, including the Discovery itself. Number 7. Underslung hero. As the Star Trek Discovery team were trying to figure out exactly what the look of the series was going to be, what the ships were going to be designed like, and how they were going to approach everything, the actual design of the Zhenzhou itself was used to test new ideas. Early renderings of the ship contained many different configurations and liveries. There were some that had highly accented turquoise colour, and some that were closer to the dove grey of the original Matt Jeffries USS Enterprise. There was a much more serious stealth bomber look also proposed that would have had faceted hull panels facing back against each other. Ultimately though, a more traditional Aztec type pattern was used for the hull of the Zhenzhou, while even at this stage, they still weren't exactly sure where the bridge was going to go. There were a few different ideas for where the bridge would go in the Zhenzhou, including a note from the art department that said, why not put it in a notch at the very front of the ship? That, however, was swept to the side once the producers said, let's put it under the primary hull. According to John Eves, the notes we got said its bridge should be located at the bottom of the ship. There was no explanation for it, but I thought, okay, let's go for it. The unique location of the ship allowed them to build a practical set that was raised slightly with windows going down under this. These would be looking out onto what would of course later be added in post, CGI starfields almost completely surrounding the crew. Following the release of the series, John Eves commented on the unusual bridge location and the subversion of fan expectations. When the studio made a teaser trailer to introduce the series, they started by showing the Zhenzhou upside down. The Star Trek audience naturally thought they were looking at the top of a ship. Then they showed the ship rotate. Everyone was really surprised when they realized that the bridge was on the bottom. It was a very cool concept and it worked really well. Number 6. Sooner or lateral. While all 5 previous live-action Star Trek shows had been filmed down at Paramount Studios, Discovery was the first, but not the last, to be filmed at Pinewood Studios in Toronto, Canada. There, a series of elaborate sets were created, like the Discovery's bridge, the Zhenzhou's bridge, and a large amount of corridors, sickbay, engineering, a transporter room, and of course Lorca's Menagerie. Because the premiere episodes, The Vulcan Hello and The Battle of the Binary Stars, were going to be located almost exclusively on board the Shenzhou, there had to be a way of reconfiguring the sets so that they could look like they were from two different ships. Now, simple repainting of the corridors allowed the Shenzhou's corridors and the Discovery's corridors to stand in for one another. A reconfiguration of Lorca's Menagerie gave us the brig of the Shenzhou, but it was Discovery's transporter room that went through the most extensive redress for these episodes. It was given a unique lighting scheme, it was given a circular transporter control, and it was given lateral vector emitters, which are more primitive and designed to be used on the much older USS Shenzhou. Fun fact about those lateral vector emitters, in Star Trek's great history of reusing props, those emitters would turn up again in the episode Brother aboard the USS Hiawatha. They would also appear again in the episode The Red Angel as phase discriminators. Number 5, A Long Walker. With the script for the Battle of the Binary Stars calling for an entire slew of Federation starships to face off against the Klingon fleet, John Eaves worked not just to bring the Shenzhou to life, but all of the other ships as well. According to Eaves, whenever we were waiting for feedback on the Discovery and the Shenzhou, we'd do concepts for fleet ships on the side. I'd keep drawing those and we ended up with 60 or 70 of them. I think they said they were going to take 6 or 7 of the fleet ships and build them. If I'm not mistaken, Brian Fuller picked all of the fleet ships and he'd always go for the more unusual shapes. In order to explain these ships' enormous visual differences from the contemporary 23rd century ships in the rest of Starfleet, Eaves and Cheryanowski worked together to come up with a backstory. We eventually came up with a theory to explain why these new ships didn't have round nacelles and looked a bit out of place. We came up with this idea that it was like the old Edwards Air Force Base in the 1940s. All these companies were creating these new X-planes, and even though the purpose was the same, they all looked drastically different. So we created this whole scenario that this was like an experimental stage. Up to that point, the Vulcans had been influential on matters of ship design, but now the humans had decided that they'd had enough of that influence and they wanted to go on their own. Consistent with that ethic, Cheryanowski and Eaves decided to name each of these ships after test pilots of those X-planes, specifically choosing the Shenzhou to be a Walker-class ship, named for American test fight and X-15 pilot Joseph A. Walker. Number 4, Good Shepherd. As the first year of Starfleet Discovery developed in the writer's room, the producers alerted the art department to the fact that another ship was required. This is outside of the Discovery, Shenzhou, and the fleet. This ship, the USS Curie, was intended to be another experimental Federation starship, and so a unique design was required by John Eaves. Returning to early sketches of the USS Shenzhou, Eaves flipped the ship over, moved the bridge back a little bit, and placed the engines above the primary hull. The basic lines were a rejected Shenzhou, but I reworked it to be the Curie. Bridging the gap between the Shenzhou and the brand new Discovery, Eaves came up with the Shepherd-class Curie, which would later be renamed the Kerala and then dropped from the show entirely. Deciding that the experimental ship would be the same as the Discovery herself, the Crossfield-class USS Glenn was introduced in the episode Context is for Kings. The Curie, aka the Kerala, would go on to appear at the Battle of the Binary Stars, and then would stand in for the USS Gagarin in the episode CV Pacem Parabellum. So, no, you weren't just seeing an upside-down Shenzhou in those episodes. But close. Number 3, Memory Beta. With 2 full episodes dedicated to being on board the Shenzhou, Star Trek Discovery's producers put a little more time into coming up with backstories for the ill-fated crew. Alongside series regulars and returning characters like Captain Philippa Georgiou, Commander Michael Burnham, Lieutenant Commander Saru, Lieutenant Junior Grade Kayla Detmer, and Ensign Danby Connor, the crew of the Shenzhou were filmed out with unique character and alien designs to really make them stand out. You had the blue-skinned Lieutenant Troke, you had the cybernetic Lieutenant Troy Januzzi, and Ensign Jira Narwani, who would wear the distinctive snail shell helmet that would appear quite a few times throughout the rest of Discovery's run. While most of the Shenzhou's crew go unnamed on screen, a lot of them actually are given extensive backgrounds in the tie-in novel Desperate Hours by author David Mack. According to Mack, this was a deliberate effort by both himself and the Discovery producers to give this crew a sense of reality, which would make what happens to them in the episodes hit home. Most of them I developed on my own, along with detailed character bios, backstories, quirks, interests, etc. Those were then submitted to the show via Kirsten Beyer for approval. Some, such as Gant, Detmer and Januzzi, ended up being used on the show. A few, like Connor and Britch Wheaton, were established by the show's writers. Also, Kirsten tells me that the Shenzhou Bridge crew actors were given my bios of their characters to provide a foundation for their performances. Number 2. Contact with Kaminar. In addition to providing them with brief histories, the novel Desperate Hours also depicts the Shenzhou crew teaming up with Captain Christopher Pike and the USS Enterprise to take on a mystery on the planet Circe 3. Despite the aforementioned effort to align the creation of the novel's characters with the show's writers and what we see on screen, Desperate Hours is, like almost all of the Star Trek novels, a non-canon adventure. Still, the Shenzhou did have at least one other mission that we know of. Sort of. 2018's short trek The Brightest Star sees Philippa Georgiou, then a lieutenant, answer the hail of Saru, who is at this point still living on Kaminar. She lands in a shuttle which is marked SHN-03, clearly indicating that she was serving aboard the Walker-class USS Shenzhou 16 years before the events of the Vulcan Hello. This would make the Shenzhou the first ship to encounter the Kelpians. However, the subsequent Discovery episode, The Sound of Thunder, would retcon this and say that Georgiou was serving aboard the USS Archimedes at the time, thus removing the Shenzhou from this very important historical event for no reason that I can really think of. And, to add insult to injury, just in case one might think, oh, maybe that's a bit of a continuity issue, no, they removed SHN from the shuttle. Number 1. Into the wild blue tinted yonder. As mentioned earlier, and in many other lists, Star Trek sets are so often reused and redressed and turned into something else. While the Shenzhou's bridge was originally designed to just be that, in the true spirit of Star Trek, it would then go on to be adapted for 2 different locations you might not have noticed, and we're here to destroy the illusion for you. For Star Trek Discovery Season 2, the bridge of the Shenzhou was heavily revamped and redesigned to become the bridge of a Section 31 stealth ship. This was under the direction of new production designer Tamara Deverell. According to Deverell, we revamped those great bones from the Shenzhou set. The bottom of the bridge had been glass, allowing the crew to look out into space, and it was all green screen in that area. There was a bunch of space down there, so I thought, let's take away the glass floor, clean out the green, and make this a 2-tiered ship with ladders going up and down. While the Section 31 ship would make numerous appearances in the second season, it did not follow Discovery through the wormhole at the end of Season 2, so a new use had to be made for this bridge set. In Season 3 of Star Trek Discovery, the bridge of the Shenzhou would become Starfleet headquarters. So many elements of the bridge had been lost or scrapped or removed along the way, but that central dome at Starfleet headquarters is the original dome from the Shenzhou's bridge.
Well, my friends, that was not the last time that it was used, because as we've seen in the released clip of Una Chen Riley's court-martial from Strange New Worlds Season 2, the room got reused again as the courtroom.
10 secrets of the USS Cerritos you need to know desperately. Number 10, California, here we come. Now, I don't know if anybody picked up on this, but the Cerritos was supposed to remind you about the state of California. Cerritos itself is a place in California. It was, of course, a California-class ship. All the other California-class ships were named after places in California. There was various California items hidden across the ship itself, including this in the captain's ready room. A very nice touch, that, in my opinion. In fact, there were so many references to California in Lower Decks that if you combined them all together, it it would make up the same number as amount of references in 15 seconds of any friggin' Red Hot Chili Peppers song. I wasn't kidding about all the other ships in the class being named after places in California as well. I don't really know too much about the place, but Paul's written it all down here, so I'm just going to read it off for him. The USS Merced is named after a place in Central California. The USS Alhambra, named after a city in San Gabriel Valley. The USS Rubidoux, named after somewhere in Riverside County. The Solvang is a place near Santa Barbara, and according to him, there's a great Oktoberfest, so I'll have to ever check that out if I'm ever allowed to leave the house. And the reason for that is because Mike McMahon knows California like the back of his hand. He worked there for years, he moved there, he had loads of jobs there, and he wanted to name all these little ubiquitous little ships, these non-grand, non-spectacular industry workhorse parts of the fleet after these places in California. He just thought that'd be a nice touch, and it is. In fact, specifically, he named the Cerritos after a car dealership called the Cerritos Auto Square. They've got a very catchy little jingle that goes, "Yes, Cerritos!" Because, get it? Like, yes, Cerritos? America's weird. Number 9, Old Reliantable. Reliant, very good, very good. Now, looking at the design of the Cerritos, it would look right at home next to a Galaxy-class ship, and probably look right at home next to a Nebula-class ship as well, the other one invented in the Next Generation. But apparently the inspiration comes from Mike McMahon's favourite ship in Star Trek, which doesn't really feel very Next Generation-y. We've given it away with the title of this, but it was the USS Reliant from Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, and of course later seen in other series of Star Trek. He loved that one, and he kind of wanted the Cerritos to look a bit like it. And the mad thing is, despite the fact that the Reliant is kind of like the opposite of the classic Star Trek design, that the nacelles are below and it's kind of all very compact instead of long and sleek, it has actually gone on to inspire a lot of different ships in the franchise. Apparently the Nebula class took its inspiration from there. Originally the Malachowski class we saw in Discovery took a page from its book, and even the USS Shenzhou itself was supposed to look like the Reliant. So even though it's traditionally not a very Star Trek shape, it is kind of the Star Trek shape. I mean, that said though, the saucer section and the deflector dish are clearly just Control-C, Control-V from the Enterprise D itself, so you can see all the different elements combining for that one. Number 8, Live and Let Livery. Paul, you live on the other side of the planet to me, and just sometimes that is a good thing. Now, in a classic callback to Star Trek's greatest ever trope of just reusing all of their props, all of the other California-class ships in Star Trek Lower Decks are identical to the Cerritos, except for one small difference, and that's the colour has been changed on both the LCARS panels and the outside of the ship itself. Basically, it's usually red in Starfleet, but the revelation in Lower Decks is the reason for that is because all the ships you've seen so far are designed for command-based missions. The Cerritos, on the other hand, is purely a support vessel, so it gets yellow, and as a result all the other support vessels get different colours. But the Merced has blue markings on the outside, clearly saying that it is a science vessel, whereas two of the other ones have red, saying that they are part of the command thing as well. It's just Star Trek likes to have that little visual reference point for you, so it's cool they put it on the outside of the ships as well. I absolutely love this one, and I completely missed it the original time watching the show, so LCARS, LCARS, whatever you want to call it, has a very, very distinct visual style that we've seen across the Next Generation, partly in Deep Space Nine and of course in Voyager. You know exactly the thing I'm talking about. It looks like this. It is just as Star Trek can be. Now, if you watch Lower Decks, you will see that the ship has been lovingly recreated to look like the ships of that era, and all of its computer consoles are precisely as you would expect them to look. But look a little further, my friends. Look to the walls, look to the floors, look to all the soft furnishings, and you will see that LCARS design transmits across every single thing on that ship. Look at it! That's really clever. I want my bed sheets to look like that. These are my spare bed sheets, by the way. The good ones are in the wash, so don't be commenting like, oh my god, really, Paisley? Oh. Number 6, old, but like future old. Now, we don't know the exact age or when it launched yet. That's yet to be revealed in Lower Decks, but the fact that this is a junky, old, clapped out, constantly in need of repair ship is one of the long-running jokes in this show. Just going to refer specifically to an interview Mike McMahon did with Trek Yards, because he kind of explains this better than I would be able to in my usual rambling style, so just let's get a picture of him up. The name of the game on the Cerritos is functionality. They have to be able to open it up and change it when it's not being used for diplomacy or speed or for battles. What the ship is good at is being taken apart apart and being utilised. It's kind of like a trusty toolbox. It looks good when it's doing it because it's Starfleet, but that's the mentality behind it. Like a lot of people said initially when they saw the design, they thought nacelles being quite weird didn't really fit with it, but McMahon goes on in that interview to say that, well, yeah, it probably isn't even the nacelles it was originally designed to have. They've just stuck those on as they've upgraded it over time, which when you think about it is a really nice little design quirk. Number 5, overpowered and undergunned. Now, at only 20 decks high, the Cerritos is on the smaller side of the ships we've seen in Star Trek. Like, yes, Voyager only had 15, but the Enterprise E had like 26 or 27, depending on who was speaking. And of course, the Enterprise A had 78 because they gave Will Shatner a pen and then just left a room. Now, what's interesting about this is that when you're in the saucer section, everything looks small and neat and tight and compact, but when you get into the drive section, everything starts to look big and huge and cavernous. Take, for example, the engine room is a lot more like things we've seen in the Abrams verse. That took 300 takes to say, by the way, because I kept saying it looks far more like the engine verse in the Abrams room. And the reason for that, and again this comes straight from Mike McMahon's interview with Trek Yards, is because the ship needed to have a lot of power, yet it still needs to be quite a small ship. So if you take a huge engine which can produce a massive warp core and you cram everybody into it, next to it, that's kind of going to be really bad. So it needed to be separate from the main body of the ship. So yes, when they needed to extend the warp bubble core thing, they could do that. When they need to extend the deflector dish, yes, they could do that. But by and large, most of the time, they just wanted people to be sat away from it. So the design actually reflects the fact it is massively overpowered for its size. Number 4, the why of the pylons. Anyway, something that does slightly contradict that whole idea if they wanted to keep people away from the massive power level that it actually had, but is still interesting nonetheless, is how you get from the saucer section to the drive section, because they're not directly connected. Like pretty much every Star Trek ship we've ever had, you sort of look at that and you can see how you would walk from the bridge to the engine room, because it's just one big ship and you go where all the windows and the lights is. It just makes sense. But on the Cerritos, what are you doing? Are you going down the legs? Is there a secret invisible tube? No, again, according to Mike McMahon at Trek Yards, the turbo lift shafts just go down the struts and then through the warp nacelle pylons, which is part of the reason they look the way they do. Like, they're designed to be insulated, they're designed to be protective, so you can safely travel through them without getting electrified. And if you're wondering why there are a giant big part of those pylons cut out, it's because they're not being used for anything. They're just literally turbo lift shafts, so why would you need them filled in? Like, it saves resources, it saves space, it just makes everything lighter, which doesn't really make sense in space, but they don't need to be filled in, so they wouldn't be. Well, I guess it does make sense, because he did go on to say that you want less material that's able to vibrate, which actually does fit with thermo and aerodynamics, so I guess it does make sense, but I still stand by the fact that it looks like garden furniture. Number 3, about those dune buggies. Now, one thing that always jumped out at me was the fact that yes, this looked exactly like it was set right in the middle of the Next Generation, but it isn't. It's a full 15 years after so it's like way in the future. And you look at some of the design choices they made, like, for example, the shuttlecraft. They're all boxy and not very sleek and slender. They look exactly like the janky ones they have in the Next Generation, and not the really cool ones they had in Nemesis or in Voyager or things like that. So why? Well, the simple reason for that is because there is limited resources in the galaxy. So when Starfleet gets brand new shuttlecraft, they go to your Enterprises and to your Voyagers and to all the other big flagships. What do you think the Cerritos gets? It gets the old stuff, because it's still perfectly usable. It just doesn't need to be on the front lines, like everything with the tricorders, the replicators, the panels, the shuttlecraft, as I mentioned before, the phasers, everything. It's just stuff that's been in Starfleet for a long old time. It's not broken, there's no sense throwing it away, it still works, it just doesn't need to be on the Enterprise. That said though, not everything it gets is necessarily old or clapped out. Some stuff is still brand new and exciting, just not being used at the minute, hence why they have an Argo dune buggy. Obviously everybody involved in Star Trek Nemesis was so embarrassed about having that on the ship that they just chucked it to the next support vessel that wanted a dune buggy. And well, there it is. Number 2, nice aft. Just a really quick, funny one this. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but the emblazoned name bit of the USS Cerritos is not where it is on normal Star Trek ships. It's not at the front, as it's, you know, when you get the opening title credits and it's panning around the front and you get to see USS Cerritos. Not there, is it? It's on the back of the ship, which is, when you think about it, a really weird place to put it. Reason for that is because, by and large, most people seeing the Cerritos up close aren't going to be in some kind of performative space. They're not going to be glaring at it and marveling at its wonder. They're going to be getting towed. by it. Yep, the majority of times people will need to see the registry and name of that ship is because they're getting towed along by it in a pinch. So they put the registry on the back so that they can see that. Number 1, there be dolphins here. Oh, it's the best. Genuinely, when I heard they were doing Lower Decks, and of course, when you do something animated, all of a sudden, budget is not a problem. You haven't got to think about making sets. You haven't got to think about practicalities. You haven't got to think about what you really can do with the show, and instead just do whatever the hell you want to do. That's what I was thinking about. And so, of course, my first thought was Cetacean Ops. Now, for those of you who are brand new here, Cetacean Ops is part of the Enterprise D, where dolphins, yes, actual dolphins, serve in Starfleet to help with complex navigational and mathematical problems. Like, they solve them because they think in three-dimensional space and they're incredibly intelligent. And it was written into the very fabric of Star Trek The Next Generation, but never used because, again, real-life show, how do you make an entire room full of dolphins? And I say room, it was like 3 decks high. It was referenced in yesterday's Enterprise. Geordi LaForge asked somebody if they have seen the dolphins in another episode, but we never got to see it, and yet we still haven't seen it, even on a show where they just have to draw it. But I am very pleased to report that speaking to Will Wheaton, yes, that Will Wheaton of the Ready Room, Mike McMahon confirmed that there is a Cetacean Ops aboard the USS Cerritos. They just haven't showed it to us yet. They are not promising, but they are hopeful that sometime in season 2, we will get to see that. And by we, I mean me. Flippers crossed. That's Paul's joke.
10 secrets of the First Contact fleet.
Number 10.
Akira, Steamrunner, Norway, and Sabre. Oh my. Obviously, the main star of Star Trek First Contact is the beautiful Sovereign-class Enterprise E that was designed by John Eaves. If you've even walked near one of the lists about the ships before, you're gonna know who John Eaves is. Another name comes into the Star Trek pantheon in Star Trek First Contact, and that is Alex Yeager. He was the Industrial Light and Magic visual effects director on Star Trek First Contact, and we have him to thank for these new designs of ships that rock up in the Battle of Sector 001. Yeager was given a bit of a task, which is you have to introduce, along with the Sovereign class, which was being done, as I say, by Eaves, introduce these new designs of ship, and they have to be instantly distinguishable from the new vessel. He had a bit of a challenge ahead of him. He said, the goal with all of those ships was to make them look completely different from the Enterprise, as we were introducing the E in that film, and they didn't want people going, wait, which one's the Enterprise? Therefore, the very radical layouts on those 4 ships, but still keeping true to the basics of starship design. You gotta bear in mind, Alex Yeager was 22 at the time. At 22, I was still figuring out button-up flies on my jeans, and yet he rocks up with these 4 designs, and Rick Berman, Jonathan Frakes, and production designer Herman Zimmerman all go, that one, that one, that one, and that one, boom. They make it in the film, and they have almost all of them turned up again later on in Star Trek. Number 9, ready for her close-up. Probably the most popular of these new designs is the Akira-class USS Thunderchild. Now, in the film, we don't know the name of the ship because it's actually not printed on the saucer section. The registry is NCC 63549. Now, during the production process, Yeager actually said that the Akira class quickly became not just a favorite, obviously, of fans after the film was released, but it was a favorite during the production process as well. The producers initially planned to have at least one ship that we could get closer to camera. That was the Akira, so it got the most attention to detail. So Yeager treated the Akira class the same way he would any other hero ship. That means that you could get up close and personal with this ship. The way, think about the other films. You know, you get these beautiful pan shots of the Constitution class 1701, you get those pan shots when we're in space dock, and of course the Enterprise D in Generations as well, because that's where the bulk of the action is. Of course you're going to take more time, and that's how popular the Akira class was, is they gave it that level of attention in the film, even though it doesn't have an awful lot of screen time in the released movie. Now, the design was actually inspired by the USS Reliant, the Miranda class that of course had been introduced back in Wrath of Khan. Those had the nacelle swept underneath with a roll bar over the back, and both of those ideas were incorporated into the Akira class. Added to this was a veritable ton of firepower specifically designed to take on the Borg. According to Jaeger, this was my gunship battlecruiser aircraft carrier. It had 15 torpedo launchers and 2 shuttle bays, one in the front with 3 doors and one in the back. I really got into it with that one. The whole idea was that the front bay would be the launching bay and that they could return and come in the back because they'd be protected by the rest of the ship. Number 8. Days of Thunderchild. If you're wondering where the name for the USS Thunderchild comes from, it comes from that. The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. It was based on the RMS Thunderchild that fatefully has an encounter with the Martians in this novel. Now, the class of ship, the Akira class, came from Jaeger's own love of the 1988 Japanese anime film Akira. We've already gone into the amount of firepower that was packed into this ship in the previous entry, but Jaeger had another task, which was where and when does the Akira class fit in to the rest of the Federation fleet? Now, according to Jaeger, the Akira class, it has the same escape pods as the Enterprise E, the Sovereign class, but it actually has a more similar hull plating to the Enterprise D. Now, that was to suggest that it was commissioned after the Galaxy class entered service, but before the Sovereign class entered service. It becomes an immediate fan favorite, but it also becomes one of the producers' favorite, which almost led to the design being taken wholesale and used for the NX-01 in Enterprise. If you want that full story, go and check out our Secrets of the NX-01 list, our interview with Doug Drexler, and you'll get all the juicy details there. Number 7, background action. Now, while the Akira gets treated to the full and fancy hero ship treatment, the other ships do not get anywhere near as much love. Now, these include the Steamrunner class, which was originally called Streamrunner. Did not know that before I was recording this list. That was the USS Appalachia. Then there was the Norway class USS Budapest and the Sabre class USS Jaeger. These were deliberately designed to be more angular and less detailed so that they could be there to kind of fill out the Federation fleet without having to necessarily get up close and front with the camera. That way, when the scenes were being rendered, these models were not given anywhere near the same level of detail as the other ships in that scene. While you would never be able to notice it in the actual film, like you'd want to zoom in times 1,000,000 or something like that, the actual paneling textures were borrowed. For example, the Sabre class, right, the paneling on that was borrowed from the digital model of the USS Enterprise D that had been used in Star Trek Generations. And the Norway class was given the texturing of the ILM version of the USS Defiant. Did somebody mention Defiant? Number 6, Defiance. Now, as you'll know, there's already a list and an article on the USS Defiant. I strongly advise you to go and check it out. This ship is just full of wee secrets. But its story could have ended with Star Trek First Contact. Now, while it's unbelievably cool seeing the Defiant on the big screen, yes, I still remember that. Yes, I'm probably older than a lot of people watching this video. It was, according to Ronald D. Moore, as one of the writers on the film, a necessary plot device to get Worf to the solar system to battle the Borg. So, I mean, it's fantastic. You see it's firing the pulse phasers and it's running alongside of the Borg. You know, unfortunately, once we see it, it's gone through a bit of an L challenge. This presented an issue when it came to behind the scenes. For example, when Ronald D. Moore sent the script to DS9 producer and eventual showrunner Ira Steven Behr, heads were butted. Somehow we had implied that, like, the Defiant was destroyed or something. We didn't mean to destroy the Defiant, but Behr just ranted at me for destroying the Defiant, and it was really his only note on the whole script. So we went back and we were very careful that the Defiant actually did survive. Now, there is indeed a scene which shows Worf being, well, beamed off the Defiant, cameo by the lovely Adam Scott for all you Parks and Rec fans out there. Worf then insists on coming to the bridge of the Enterprise E and asks immediately about the Defiant. Picard says, adrift, but salvageable, and then we get our tough little ship joke. Absolutely love it. Do you know who didn't love it? Ira Steven Behr. He was quoted as saying, I didn't see the point in bringing it on just to kick the crap out of it. Number 5, cannon fodder. So we've addressed the new ships that appeared in Star Trek First Contact, but what was going on with the rest of the fleet? Because there's some very recognizable ships dotted out there as well. Now, of course, these include the Miranda class, the Oberth class, and the Nebula class. Star Trek First Contact was actually the last on-screen appearance of the filming models of the Miranda and Oberth class starships. These had both made their debut appearances in Star Trek 2 and 3 respectively, so they'd been around for a long time at this point. The recycled ships were fairly difficult to make out on screen, but dialogue does refer to the USS Bozeman. If you remember, Cause and Effect from the Next Generation's 5th season featured an augmented Miranda-class vessel, which was then called the Soyuz-class USS Bozeman under the command of Kelsey Grammer's Captain Morgan Bateson. Brannon Braga hails from Bozeman, Montana, so likely the inclusion was more just a cameo to where he's from. But it also then ties quite nicely into what the Bozeman was doing once it got to the 24th century. This will be expanded on in the novel Ship of the Line, which again featured Captain Bateson, and also in Decipher's Star Trek customizable card game, which is basically Star Trek's answer to Magic the Gathering in their First Contact expansion pack. Number 4. Technobabble. It was established that the full length of the Enterprise E was 2,248 feet. The diameter of the Borg cube was 9,000 feet, and the diameter of the Borg sphere was 1,500 feet. So they're established in size by the designers. The rest of the new ships in First Contact, however, literally had little blank spaces beside them for anyone to just come up with the actual size of these ships. However, as these vessels started to pop up in reference novels and encyclopedias, for example, Michael and Denise Okuda's second edition Star Trek Encyclopedia, it was left to these kind of franchise heavyweights, the Okudas, Rick Sternbach, and Doug Drexler, to come up with a scaling system for these vessels. First up is the Akira class. Now, listed in DS9's technical manual in 1998, it stated that the Akira was a heavy cruiser class starship, that it was designed at the Antares Fleet Yards on Antares 4, was designed for a crew of 500, and measured 464.43 meters in length. According to the same resource, the Norway and Sabre class vessels were both listed as being created in space dock above Earth. The Sabre class could only carry 40 officers, while the Norway was listed as being able to carry 190. However, both vessels were listed as being 364.77 meters in length, which doesn't really make any sense if one of them can carry almost 4 times the amount of crew as the other. According to DS9's visual effects supervisor David Stipes, the Sabre was scaled down to about 190 meters in length, which makes it just longer than the USS Defiant. The Steamrunner class took the longest to get an actual size because it was in fact the Eaglemoss Starships collection that put 356 meters on the length of it. Basically, it was the bastard stepchild of the rest of the fleet. Which is a bit of a shame, really. I like the Steamrunner class. I seem to have been the only one. 356 meters in length. Number 3. A Star Wars story. Yep, I have just uttered the very heated words when it comes to the two franchises. Pfft, please, we're over that. You're probably all well aware at this stage that a very special ship makes a blink and you'll miss it cameo in the Battle of Sector 001. Yeah, the Millennium Falcon is actually present fighting the Borg cube. And no, I'm not just making that up. And no, that's not something that was digitally added years later. ILM's John Knoll had just come off working on the special edition trilogy of Star Wars in the 90s. And as a bit of a joke, added the Millennium Falcon into the Battle of Sector 001. So no, it's there. It is 100% in the film. Much like R2-D2 is in 2 of the J.J. Abrams Kelvin films. It's kind of like it or not, Star Wars is in Star Trek. Star Trek Online designer and YouTuber E.C. Henry actually took the time to design what the Millennium Falcon would look like if it was panelled with Starfleet livery. And actually, it looks really, really cool. Now, the link to that will be in the description of this video. It's pretty sweet, actually. Definitely different. Listen, otherwise you've got a Corellian freighter fighting the Borg. You know, you make up your mind. There were other ships shown to be fighting the Borg, but not in the actual film. The first theatrical trailer for Star Trek First Contact pictured USS Voyager. Obviously, that never made it into the final film, so I would imagine what that was is it was a placeholder. They needed to get the trailer out, the effects weren't ready on the film yet, so they stuck in what they had, which actually makes an awful lot of sense, really. So that's why we get, for, at least in headcanon, maybe, Voyager fought the Borg cube as they left the Delta Quadrant and then arrived in the Alpha Quadrant. You heard it here first, folks. Number 2, fleeting appearances. After Star Trek First Contact wraps production, ILM gave the digital assets to Paramount Pictures for them to use for Star Trek Deep Space Nine and Star Trek Voyager. Sounds great in theory. However, all of the technology that ILM was using was actually quite different to what Paramount Pictures were using, so the First Contact ships had to be rebuilt again basically from scratch. Bear in mind, the Akira class got the most love, so actually that one was easiest to slot back into Star Trek, which is why the Akira class is the one that probably makes the most appearances in Deep Space Nine, debuting in Call to Arms, along with the Sabre and the Steamrunner class ships, but it also appears in Star Trek Voyager, most prominently in the episode Message in a Bottle. As I mentioned, the Steamrunner and Sabre class ships also appeared in both DS9 and Voyager, but their appearances, they're much less frequent and they are much further away from the screen because they're just not being rendered to the same quality. They were in the final shot of Star Trek Voyager as well, escorting that lovely Intrepid class ship back to Earth, and we were then robbed of a scene immediately afterwards and Voyager ended too early. I'm over it. There was, of course, a very missing ship in DS9 and Voyager. Number 1, lost with all hands. The Norway class made its only appearance in Star Trek First Contact. It never appeared in Star Trek Deep Space Nine or in Star Trek Voyager, and hasn't appeared after that in the franchise either. DS9's David Stipes gave a very cryptic response. Basically, he just said, "I believe we didn't include the Norway class for technical reasons." That's it. So whether that means the CGI file itself was corrupted, or frankly, they just didn't bother, we never got it on screen. Almost 25 years later on, again, along comes Eaglemoss. Eaglemoss replicated all 4 of the ships, including the Norway class, for its ships collection. And, according to Ben Robinson on Twitter, this is what led directly to the Steamrunner class being included in Star Trek Picard's 2nd season. If that's the case, it might take a while, but hope is not lost that we may see the Norway class again in action. I've got my fingers crossed, and I bet some of you do as well. 10 secrets about the USS Stargazer you need to know. Number 10, the pressure of legacy. The design of the USS Stargazer brought together a few old names from Star Trek along with a few of the newer ones. The team was headed by production designer Dave Blass and saw the return of John Eves and Doug Drexler, and also Sean Hargreaves, who designed the Enterprise A in Star Trek Beyond, Jeffrey Mandel, who was part of the design team of Star Trek Insurrection, and of course, Michael Okuda. The team was tasked with designing a ship that would be both new for the 25th century era of Star Trek Picard, but also evocative of the original design by Andy Probert and John Dwyer. According to production designer Dave Blass, we needed to update the classic USS Stargazer design that was seen briefly in the TV series Star Trek The Next Generation, and update the design of a Starfleet starship into a new century. How would we update the technology to work for modern audiences while also staying true to the original Next Generation feel? Despite this new Stargazer's fidelity to Captain Picard's original command, first seen in the battle, this creature was very much its own thing. Now, it was both evocative of that original Constellation class, but also a new design of a TOS-era Radiant class USS Stargazer that was designed by fan model maker Bill Krause. Number 9, a command with baggage. In the show, Picard says that this Stargazer is a refit of his original Stargazer. And you might look at the design and be like, now, these are a little bit too different. But according to showrunner Terry Matalas, that is actually true. Like the TMP Enterprise, it's a massively updated refit, he said. I like to think of it as the story of the broom. If one day you replace the handle and another day the brush, is it still the same broom? We thought of it as a vessel endlessly repaired and upgraded, brought in line with current future tech. so that somewhere underneath all the lights and polish are the bones of Picard's original ship. Does it make sense? I don't know, but I sure like the spirit of it. Whether it makes sense or not, the producer still felt that the Stargazer was a minor vessel in the pantheon of Starfleet names. Dave Blass had this to say about the ship's registry. I dropped the hammer on this one. The Stargazer is an important ship, but it does not hold the same status in the Federation that the Enterprise had. I didn't feel it was warranted. Because then every ship gets it and it becomes a thing, the Stargazer didn't have that legacy. Therefore, there was no A at the end of the registry. Number 8. What does a starship need with a carpet? The interiors of the Stargazer were designed by Dave Blass and Sean Hargreaves, who, as previously mentioned, designed the Enterprise A for Star Trek Beyond. Constructed at Santa Clarita Studios in Santa Clarita, California, there was a main bridge built along with a corridor set and an observation lounge set. According to Dave Blass, the bridge was constructed 10 feet wider than the Enterprise E bridge so that they could take advantage of the new widescreen format that Star Trek Picard was going to be shown in. Designed to evoke Herman Zimmerman's Star Trek The Next Generation sets, which carried over into the movies as well, there is one thing that is missing from the Stargazer: ample carpeting. According to Sean Hargreaves, there's been discussion on some of the online threads about whether there should have been carpet. I disagree wholeheartedly. This isn't a cruise ship, nor a living room. When it gets down to carpet, no carpet, how shiny the floors are, etc., it's missing the point. Number 7. Observation lounge observations. It sounds very strange to say the word observations without a certain word in front of it. Accomplished fan model maker Bill Krause was tasked with creating practical models of the Sagan-class USS Stargazer, as well as the Constellation-class USS Stargazer seen in The Next Generation. He was also tasked with creating a TOS-era version of the Stargazer, and all 3 of these models were used as set dressing in the observation lounge of this modern Stargazer. Other elements that were used as well were the original plaque from the episode The Battle, and of course a model of Captain Rios's original ship, La Serena. According to production designer Dave Blass, the lounge set was a technological achievement in itself and featured a real view outside the windows. Custom conference table featured a gigantic integrated OLED screen, as well as integrated lighting. The chairs were custom designed to harken back to the Enterprise E version of the chairs. The highlight of the set is the panoramic view out the back of the ship with giant windows showcasing the aft of the Stargazer. Number 6. Because callbacks. According to set designer Sean Hargreaves, the Stargazer was a group effort, but the overall look was accomplished by John Eaves and Doug Drexler. As they say, it takes a village. I just want everyone to get credit where credit is due. It's only fair. If you like the exterior of the Stargazer, that's John Eaves through and through, with Doug finessing. Known for creating exhaustively detailed starships, like the NX-01 for Enterprise, Drexler included things like phaser strips, transporter emitters, tractor beam emitters, and including a shuttle bay as well between the 2 dorsal nacelle struts at the back of the Stargazer. The Stargazer also possessed 2
warp field governors
located on the dorsal side of the saucer section, starboard and port. Not sure what a warp field governor is? Well, there's a long and detailed explanation for it, but basically it's an Easter egg. The TOS movie era ships always contain these. If you think of it, both the Reliant and the TMP Enterprise had them at the rear of the saucer section. So basically, it's just a nice nod to previous designs. Number 5, Stylegazer. Alright, this one's not technically about the ship itself, but go with us here for a second. Season 2 of Picard introduces a new Starfleet uniform, something that really seems to be happening every 3 episodes in Star Trek since 2017. Created by costume designer Christine Clark, Starfleet's 2400 uniforms are an improved version of the same uniforms from Star Trek Picard's Season 1. According to Clark, our Starfleet uniforms in Season 1 were admittedly created in a bit of a haste, and though they're perfectly lovely designs, me and our producers felt we could deliver something more grand for Season 2. With Starfleet playing a much more featured role in Season 2, I wanted to pick up where we left off, but create a sleeker, more sophisticated design for 2400. This new spin on Starfleet's DS9, Voyager and TNG era uniforms features a dimensional raised ink delta across the shoulders, an asymmetrical style jacket with a division colour running down the trousers as well. It was meant to be evocative of the monster maroons that were introduced in The Wrath of Khan, just one of the many callbacks to the original series in Star Trek Picard. Number 4, Starfleet. Okay, again, this one not technically about the Stargazer itself, but it kind of flows, right? There's been an awful lot said about the arrival of the Federation fleet in the first and last episodes of Star Trek Picard Season 2. There's even a list just waiting to be written about this fleet itself. Paul. But let's touch on the fleet briefly here, because it's still one of the best parts of Picard's second season. According to an interview with Dave Blass with Inverse's Ryan Britt, the different ships that appear in Star Trek Picard Season 2 was effectively a direct response to the angry outcry of fans from the last episode of the first season of Star Trek Picard. I know that there's a lot of practical reasons why things happen, but I was like, okay, I wonder if there's a way to solve this problem, to turn this obstacle into an opportunity. I found these ships from Star Trek Online and I was like, damn, these are really good looking. I was like, why are we not doing something here? With limited resources available to the effects department, Star Trek Picard turned to Star Trek Online, sourcing several of their ships to appear alongside the Stargazer in the pilot and the final episode. The show also received aid from Eaglemoss's Star Trek Starships collections by providing digital models of ships like the Akira class. All of this in response to the so-called copy and paste fleet that appeared in the season 1 finale, A in Arcadia Ego Part 2. So, next time you wonder if an angry rant about Star Trek starships is worth something on Twitter. Love you, Dave. Number 3, Elkar's Mania. Fitting Star Trek Picard's second season now in the 25th century, new user interfaces were created by Andrew Jarvis and Twisted Media for display on the bridge of the USS Stargazer. These referenced back to the 24th century Elcars of Star Trek The Next Generation, but also pushed the aesthetic forward. For Season 2, Jarvis and Twisted Media were joined by Michael Okuda, the man who originally created the Elcars, lovingly dubbed Okudograms, for Star Trek The Next Generation, and Doug Drexler, who presented the production with original assets from the shows. Like the original Okudograms of The Next Generation DS9 and Voyager, Star Trek Picard's Elcars interfaces were integrated into the USS Stargazer's bridge using static backlit panels and animated live feed monitors, OLEDs, integrated into the ship's consoles and interfaces on set. This time though, the set designers were able to give the ship's computers an even more futuristic look by creating curved screens throughout the bridge. These curved Elcars displays were achieved live on set using real projection and non-reflective flex glass screens. According to systems integrator and computer playback supervisor Todd A. Marks, having this wide display area, no one else has ever done something with the kind of complex curves on a practical set before. Number 2, normalize Star Trek Insurrection references. Sometimes myself and Paul might disagree on some of the points on these lists, but here is one where I am in complete agreement. Star Trek Insurrection is good, actually. Of the 4 Next Generation movies, it is the one that is closest to an episode of The Next Generation. While that is often used as a criticism, I think of it as a compliment. It captures the pace and thoughtfulness of The Next Generation, features a beautiful score by Jerry Goldsmith, lush visuals by cinematographer Matthew Leonetti, and loads of John Eves-style spaceships, including a slew of Starfleet auxiliary vessels. While references to Star Trek Insurrection have been light in the years since its release, the Sona are name-dropped in Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and the Baku are given a shout in Star Trek Discovery's 4th season, Star Trek Picard's 2nd season contains a big nod to Star Trek Insurrection, the Stargazer's complement of shuttlecraft. Glimpsed only briefly in the Stargazer, the shuttlecraft that ferries Admiral Picard to the Stargazer is based on the Type 11 design of shuttlecraft that was created by John Eves for Star Trek Insurrection. This design was dubbed the Type 14 and was nearly identical to the Type 11, although it featured an additional antenna assembly on the dorsal side of the ship and Stargazer-style nacelles. Also of note, the Type 14 shuttle in this episode is actually graced with its own name, the USS Jameson, named after astronaut Mae Jameson, who appeared as transporter operator Palmer in the Next Generation episode, Second Chances. Number 1, See you in the funny pages. As of the recording of this, we are yet to know if the USS Stargazer is going to appear in the 3rd season of Star Trek Picard. We can say, however, that it has continued to fly in the printed, digital, pages of IDW's ongoing comic series, Star Trek Stargazer. In that series, there is a new officer in command taking over for acting Captain 7 of 9. This is the Andorian officer Makara, who invites Admiral Picard aboard the Stargazer to relive some of his glory days. As for the filmed adventures of the USS Stargazer, we will have to see, but it is continuing a legacy that several of the other ships in Star Trek's history have passed down, which is its sets have been redressed and redesigned to serve as the USS Titan A in the 3rd season. With so much history from the inception of Star Trek going into the design of the Sagan-class Stargazer itself, it's only fitting that the Stargazer would lend its own advances to a new generation of starship. You know, I think there might be a list in that.
10 secrets of the USS Discovery you need to know. Number 10, Crossfield class. I always forget about this now, but we didn't actually see the USS Discovery until like 3 episodes in to the 1st season, which was kind of weird. Anyway, when we were introduced to it, it was the most advanced, sleekest, sexiest, nicest, weirdly wrong uniformed ship in the fleet, the Crossfield class. Just in case you're interested, and I know that you are, the name is an homage to the American test pilot of the X-15 rocket. I think that's right, Albert Scott Crossfield. They just took his last name. That simple. And the thing is, while one of the major criticisms of Discovery was just that's not what ships looked like back then, they do kind of address this in the 2nd season when the Enterprise crew comes aboard. And even though the Constitution class is the cream of the Federation crop at the time, because Discovery is a testbed for new technologies, the crew even remarks that, wow, this is where Starfleet puts its pennies. You see, they listened, they got it. Anyway, point to my point, we do only ever see one other Crossfield class ship in all of Star Trek, and that is technically the doomed USS Glenn, the sister ship that she goes to find. You remember that one? The thing's crawling around in the dark. Anyway, it's not a popular class by any stretch of the imagination, but it does look nice. Number 9, Titanic inspirations. Now, yeah, we all got excited because this was the first time we'd seen a new hero ship in a very, 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 very long time. I don't count the Abrams one. That is a reimagining of the classic. Obviously, it was probably the NX Enterprise, the last brand new hero ship we got to set our eyes on. And we were like, yeah, that's really cool, a brand new ship. But the big Star Trek fans, the bad nerds like us went, new, it's not quite new. Now, the little sneak look we got at it at the 2016 San Diego Comic-Con, yes, was very exciting, but it was an unfinished version of the model. And a lot of people looked at that and thought, hang on, I've seen this somewhere before, because they had. That ship that we saw then, and indeed the finished version of the USS Discovery itself, takes so many design cues from Ken Adams and Ralph McQuarrie's iconic reimagining of the USS Enterprise for the never-ever-got-made Star Trek Planet of the Titans. This was the reimagining for the USS Enterprise that was going to debut in the new series and the new films in the 1970s that ultimately never got made, but all the concept art is still kicking around, and they took look at it, that just is Discovery, isn't it? Except it's got nice long sleek nacelles. It isn't quite as made of Duplo as that one is. There is actually a fully fleshed out script and how the whole story was going to go for that stuff. And yes, a lot of the elements did get incorporated into the motion picture eventually, but not the core premise of the story, which we might end up doing a video on if you're interested, in the comments. Number 8, non-Trek influences. Alright, there are 2 major things that are not Star Trek related that contributed to the design aesthetic of the USS Discovery, and I will give you all 10 seconds right now to guess what they are. Bzzzt, wrong, it's this aeroplane. Yeah, the XB-70 Valkyrie, it's got the gooseneck, it's got the A shape. It was pretty much a large source of inspiration for how they made that ship look, along with, of course, the never-used Enterprise from Planet of the Titans. Why? I don't know. I do not know, but there it is. Oh, and the second thing, what was your guess for that? Bzzzt, that's wrong as well. It was James Bond's submarine car. I wish I was making that up. I'm not. Number 7, an early version lives on. All right, now I could hear you all shouting through the camera when I brought it up. Yes, when they showed us that preview at Comic-Con of the new Discovery for the new show, there's a lot of people did notice that it wasn't, how do I put this, at all finished. It looked rubbish. I'm not being unkind there, like they hadn't finished doing it and it wasn't in the highest res and all this. And yes, we were excited for a new show and the promise of all that came with it, but it kind of, like, I think I could have made that. If you give me a powerful enough computer and enough time, I could have probably made that animation. And I suck. It's nobody's fault that obviously they just hadn't finished all the ideas for it. It's just weird that they would then put an unfinished version out because they still had like over a year of tweaking the overall design left to do. And of course they did tweak the overall design. They added much nicer nacelles. They rendered it in a higher quality for a start. That is not the finished version. That is an early version. And unfortunately, because they released it, it's out there. Like a lot of the marketing materials and a lot of the packaging and a couple of the toys and a lot of the postcards, just all the collection stuff that came out before the show pretty much looks like this version of the ship. Now, if you cast your mind back to us doing the Enterprise E version when they hadn't settled on the design for the deflector dish and all the marketing materials went out with the wrong deflector dish, so technically it makes it more rare or interesting, I don't know. Discovery is plagued by this because so much stuff went out when it looked like Number 6, another used starship. Alright, now if you've watched these videos before, you will know we love to do this one because basically they don't like to waste money when they're filming Star Trek. Who would? So they tend to reuse lots of sets for lots and lots of different things. And you'll also remember, of course, that the first few episodes of Discovery are not set on Discovery. They are set on the USS Shenzhou, which is a different ship entirely. If you look at the bridge, it looks like a different ship, not entirely, but it is definitely a different ship. And also, if you look at the USS Riker's Erection, or whatever it was at the end of Picard, that's also a different ship. Anyway, bottom line here, they're all the same set. And yeah, even the Enterprise, which looks completely different, that is the same set. Basically, they realised they were going to have to film loads of stuff on bridges over the coming however many years, so they made it all very modular so that it would move around and you could redress it depending on what ship it was supposed to be. Now, it's not exactly a massive design secret, this. I just think it's really clever how they've managed to get 4, probably 5 or 6 if you include all the little one-offs they included as well, into one set. Pretty much every time you look at a bridge now in Star Trek, it is just the Discovery's bridge, just with a different layout or a different thing here or there. So well done them. Number 5, engineering, sort of. Okay, so I'm not saying Star Trek is formulaic, but tends to be when you set a show on a starship, you have the same locations that you use no matter what series it is. Like all the action takes place on the bridge, we know that. And the captain has their little room where they go and do all their little things and they're arguing with people. And there's a meeting room where all the plans are come up with and all the drama happens. There's a sick bay where people go to die. There's all the quarters where people go to... And there is the engine room. We love the engine room. Except, you've never seen Discovery's engine room. Nope, you haven't. No, that's not the engine room. That is not the engine room. You have not seen the engine room ever. We have never been to engineering. We've seen the Enterprise's engine room on Discovery. Sort of, it was the little tie-in thing. It looked like this. And that's a fairly recognisable warp core and looks not dissimilar from the engine rooms we know and love in Star Trek. But this, on Discovery, is not the engine room. That is Stamets' lab, or it's called like Engineering Test Bay Alpha, or something like that. It is not, and I'll say it again, not the engine room. Pretty vital part of the ship, IMHO, the engine room, the warp core where you go to warp. And yes, I know Discovery tends not to use its warp core, just the bloom stuff instead, but we're kind of moving away from that. The whole idea is that it's really bad, and it's bad for Stamets, even if he's got his hand in the gloop, and I really hope nothing happens to him at the end of the season, otherwise this rant I'm on will seem very, very dated already. But anyway, yeah, never seen it. Number 4, the spookiest ship in the fleet. This is a really short one. Now, obviously, I know I've just said the spookiest ship in the fleet, and there are about 10 scarier entries for that. The aforementioned USS Glenn, for one. My God, everybody was dead, and the lights are out. But technically, Discovery is the spookiest ship in the fleet, because do you remember how it was originally pitched as like a Star Trek version of American Horror Story? NCC 1031, or to put that another way, the backwards dating format that Americans use for Halloween. Number 3, 1970s colour palette. Now, full disclosure, I didn't actually notice this until the end of season 2, when, where Discovery pulls up right next to the Enterprise, and they've got that little bridge for everybody to run across. I was like, wow, Discovery's really, bronze, isn't she? You don't really notice until she's next to the silver grey of the Enterprise just how copper and bronze she actually is. And again, I can't believe I'm saying this, James Bond's Lotus Turbo Spirit thing car, the producers experimented with loads of different colour palettes to get the perfect feeling for it, and in the end they wanted something that harked back to the 1970s, and they went to this car and its weird colour scheme and thought, you know what, that'll work for a big starship. Don't know why, but they did. Number 2, From Another Mother. Alright, the elephant in the room with Star Trek Discovery that I have already touched upon is that it's very easy to sit there and go, this prequel series to the original Star Trek has one glaring flaw, and that's that it looks nothing like the era it's supposed to be set in. We have seen examples of the mid-23rd century, and they don't look like this. And the thing is, it's so easy to dismiss all of that as just as a mistake, as a goof, as a gaffe, as the producers being so intent on making something that looked really nice that they strayed away from the franchise's origins and did not care what nerds like me or you would think about that. But the truth is, not quite that. They are very aware of what they're doing, and they have reasons that they've done it that way. The reasoning is, and I hope you're sitting down for this, that Discovery was produced at a completely different shipyard to all the other ships in the fleet. The Enterprise has nice round nacelles. They would become the standard we would get used to in this time frame. But no, Discovery does not, because somebody else designed it and somebody else built it, and they were experimenting with new forms of propulsion technology, not just the bloop, 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 spore drive thing. Everything was an experiment, everything was a test, everything was new, and everything was different, intentionally. Now, you might not believe that, and I might not believe that. My theory is just that they designed a really cool looking starship and went, who cares? It's just a bit of television, but that is the reason they have given, and thus, it is canon. Number 1, my God, that's a big ship. Ah yes, another favourite of ours here on the series, inconsistent facts regarding the size of a ship in Star Trek. You love this record, we play it all the time. Alright, so first and foremost, the actual size of the USS Discovery has never been discussed on screen, thus there is no official thing we have for its size, but there have been several bits of supporting materials that have gone along with the show that state it is a whopping 750 meters long. That is far. That is, for reference, about twice the length of the original USS Enterprise. That is about 70 meters longer than the Enterprise E. That is absurd. And yeah, the really funny thing about this, my favourite part of this, in fact, is that the show has specifically stated that there are 136 crew members aboard. And just for reference, the Enterprise D, which is smaller than Discovery, has over 1,000 people on board. And we've literally done a video about how you could live on that ship and conceivably never bump into another member of the crew. So, this is wrong. Now, in fairness, there is one or two theories about this and one or two explanations of it. First of all, yes, the nacelles account for, absolutely loads of that. They are incredibly long and extend way beyond the deck of the ship itself. But the one given on screen, the most interesting one, is by Saru, who says that Discovery is outfitted for over 300 specific, discrete scientific missions, which kind of leads to the idea that, Stamets Lab, there's 300 different versions of that room, all for different things, just they haven't needed to use any of them yet. Discovery has almost limitless breakout potential depending on what mission it's needed for, but so far all we've seen is it jumping around the Klingon War and chasing after a red beacon and then jumping into the future and everybody wearing the long, wrong uniforms. So there you go. Hope we picked up on that, by the way. I'm so busy thinking about how long the ship was, I said long instead of wrong and just only managed to put it's people think this is an easy job. It really is. 10 amazing things. What are the titles of these that you need to know about the USS Excelsior / secrets or something? Number 10, whatever this says. Yes, now I'm sure whatever headline that was there, Paul, was very, very witty, very clever. However, I can't read Japanese, so I'll never know. Alright, so a bit of backstory for you. The USS Excelsior was originally christened the USS Valiant. It was described in the script work for Star Trek 3 as a super starship, a new queen of space. Now, the vast majority of the work on the ship was done by ILM, which is not really how they'd done things in the past. They'd done drawings and stuff in-house, but ILM took on the bulk of this, and instead of doing concept art, they made loads and loads of physical models so they could study them from every different angle. Now, they were all very different, very wild, very radical, but the description they had to work with was something that had to look like it was new, it was sleek, and it was, well, the Queen of Space. Now, what's either very, very good or very, very disappointing, depending on your point of view, was that the ship they selected from all of these different models was the one Leonard Nimoy described as the most Starfleet looking of the lot of them, which, yes, feels like a little bit of a cop-out. They could have done something brave and bold and ambitious, but it did have a slight twist on it. According to ILM model maker Bill George, he was absolutely obsessed with Japanese design and Japanese architecture at the time. So his model, which he produced, which ended up being the Excelsior that we all know and love, was just simply what he imagined the Enterprise would look like if it was built by the Japanese. Number 9, Models Inc. Actually, one thing ILM did learn from their time working on Star Trek was that when the Enterprise A refit model was required, it was an absolute nightmare. It weighed a ton, it was impossible to photograph because of the materials used on it, so when they built the Excelsior, they deliberately made it incredibly light and incredibly good in front of a camera. But what about all those study models, Adam? You were just talking about those. What happened to all those mad, crazy little art projects that ILM made before finally settling on the design of the Excelsior? What happened to them? I thought Star Trek couldn't abide waste. Did they throw them in the bin? Well, no, they didn't. They had all these random Starfleet designs just lying around, so when it came time to get loads of random props for Star Trek The Next Generation, guess what they used? The episode Unification Part 2 at the Surplus Depot at Quaylor 2. If you really squint and really up the brightness on your monitor, you can see several of the discarded Excelsior-style design models which never ever made it into reality. You weren't supposed to be able to see them, so they thought they would just get away with doing that, of course not predicting that in 20 years time, big nerds with nice high-end cameras and photography degrees would be able to pick them out. Oh, and also in there is one of the concept models for Star Trek Planet of the Titans, which was, we did this whole thing about it. It was this concept from the 70s that was going to be a new show for the Phase 2, and then parts of it ended up being the motion. I'm not getting into it now, but the shit was that. Oh, and because the Star Trek producers are incredibly cheeky, this one here, this specific model, that was christened the USS Alka-Seltzer. Ask your parents. Number 8, The Great N Experiment. Good, that one. I like that one for. That's good. Now, between its debut in The Search for Spock and its proper arrival into Star Trek in the Undiscovered Country, the Excelsior-class ship, and specifically again the USS Excelsior, went through some very small little design changes. Nothing you would have really noticed, and it was in the background of Star Treks 4 and 5 completely unchanged, but by the time the Undiscovered Country came around, they changed the bridge because ILM felt it was too big, and there was tiny little additions and subtractions across the primary hull and the back of the asshole. But one big change was its transition from the NX-2000 to denote that it was an experimental vessel to NCC-2000 to denote that it was just another ship in the fleet. Now, while of course the NX thing is an established part of Star Trek canon now, predominantly with the Defiant and the Enterprise from the show Enterprise, the Excelsior was the first ship to ever actually get that. In fact, if you've ever actually wondered what the whole NCC thing is about, Star Trek the original series production designer Matt Jeffries said that it's to do with American naval tradition. Like, the N means the Navy, the C means commercial, and then he just added a random extra C on to make it feel more fun and spacey. And then they've got NX because the N stands for Navy, and the X genuinely just means experimental. Number 7, fly her apart then. Oh, this is some wonderfully nitpicky stuff. You remember when they introduced the Excelsior and it was called the Big Experiment? Do you remember why that was? No, not because the captain had a mustache, because it had transwarp drive. Now, what do they mean by that? Because transwarp drive's been a thing in so many iterations of Star Trek and it's always meant different things. Well, they never actually tell you in The Search for Spock. They just laugh at the idea that somebody could try and escape them with warp drive. It's the line. I love this. My favorite scene in Star Trek, actually, the stealing the Enterprise from space dock. What is it? Now, if he tries to get away with warp drive, he's really in for a shock. Now, what we do sort of know from Star Trek is that transwarp is just the ultimate, pretty much, form of propulsion. It can get you from pretty much point A in the Alpha Quadrant to point D, wherever the hell Voyager was, in the end of one episode. So if Starfleet had that would have completely changed pretty much everything that ever happened in the subsequent shows, but apparently it was all a big failure. Now I've got here the Star Trek The Next Generation Technical Manual, which is one of the ultimate bibles for producing these videos, and it says, while the attempt to surpass the primary warp field efficiency barrier with the Transwarp development project in the early 2280s proved unsuccessful, the pioneering achievements in warp power generation and field coil design eventually led to the uprated Excelsior and Ambassador class starships. That's deliberately vague. Now, I'm not going to get into the whole thing about how transwarp is a thing in the Kelvin universe, and there was a reference to that, but it was cut and they just call it warp, but even though loads of the things that actually happen in these films are clearly transwarp and not regular warp, we're not getting into that. That's for another video. Number 6, up your shaft. Okay, right, I love this. In the episode Evolution of the Next Generation, Data says there has not been a system-wide technological failure on a starship in 79 years. Just a good random throwaway bit of dialogue, isn't it? No! It's a direct reference to the Stealing the Enterprise scene from The Search for Spock. Now, the reason the Stealing the Enterprise scene works is though everybody's on the same team, and we're all Starfleet, and we're all, you know, we're all one of the guys, etc. Every single person on that ship is incredibly dislikable. You've got James B. Sicking here, who is honestly one of my favourite one-time ever performances in Star Trek, as well as Miguel Ferrer, who, despite the fact that Paul's listed him as being in RoboCop and Mulan, is of course best known for Twin Peaks. But the single best one-time ever performance on board the Excelsior in that film is by none other than Frank Force, who you know as Leonard Nimoy. Yeah, because of course the thing is, he's not supposed to be in The Search for Spock, is he? Because he's not actually Spock. He's just like a big, like, proto-Vulcan, really weirdly horny and aggressive Vulcan on the Genesis planet. But he does feature in the film as Frank Force because he is the voice of the ship's computer, who Scotty says up your shaft to. Just a good insult, isn't it? Up your shaft. One of those ones that only works in Scottish. Up your shaft. Number 5, our obligatory reused set entry. Now, if you've watched these videos before, and let's face it, you've watched these videos before, you know that we like to point out all the reused sets and props and whatever that you can see in one part of one ship, and if you just sort of squint and turn your head, the exact same part of another ship. And of course, there is an entry for the Excelsior in that. Now, the Excelsior, as it appears in The Undiscovered Country, which is of course the definitive film appearance of that ship, is a redress set from The Next Generation, which was itself a redress set of the Enterprise A's bridge from The Final Frontier. Got it? That's all well and good, but a problem arose when they needed to reuse the Excelsior's bridge for the Voyager episode flashback, because they had reused the Excelsior bridge about 1 million times by that point. It had been the Enterprise B in Star Trek Generations, it had been the USS Prometheus, it had been the Zosa, and it had been a Romulan warbird in Deep Space Nine. According to Star Trek Voyager production designer Richard James, they went and tried to find any bits of leftover just wall or console that were kicking about in Paramount's lot. They found like 2 or 3 bits of console that were like redressed to look like Klingon things, but pretty much ended up having to build the whole thing from scratch all over again. No, I just want to give credit where it's due. They did a really good job of recreating that bridge in flashback, even though we're now working with a television budget rather than a movie one. But if you look closely, you can see that there's carpet instead of that nice metallic floor, and also the captain's chair is weirdly crap. Number 4, that's an old ship. Alright, now anybody who watches a lot of Star Trek will know that the Excelsior class ship pops up a lot across the Next Generation, and then in the Dominion Wars, and of course even finds itself a little feature in Voyager. Now, I'm not even going to try and do off the top of my head all of its appearances, because I've got them written down. You've got the USS Fearless in Where No One Has Gone Before, the USS Repulse in The Child, the USS Potemkin in Ethics, the USS Cairo in Chain of Command, the USS Crazy Horse in Descent, the USS Gorkon in Preemptive Strike. Pretty much all of that is stock footage of the USS Hood from Encounter at Farpoint, but all of them were Excelsior class ships. 50 episodes in total you can catch a glimpse of an Excelsior class starship, which is 4 more than Nog. Number 3, to be or not to be. Now, while we don't actually see the Enterprise B until Star Trek Generations, which is of course at the very end of the Next Generations run, it was assumed from the very conceptual stages of that show that the second Enterprise was going to be an Excelsior class starship. That's why it's on the wall. This is obviously common sense, as it became a major workhorse of Starfleet, but also quite cost effective because they already had a nice, lovely, big movie studio quality model of an Excelsior class starship. The Excelsior. Now, I'll hold my hands up, I missed this the first couple of times I watched that film, but they actually made some fairly major modifications to the actual shape of the ship. Most notably that, what do you call it? It's got booty now, and it's got cake. that wagon. They've also got new caps on the warp nacelles, added impulse engines, and they painted the thing like a weirdy, like purpley colour rather than its traditional blue. Now, of course, they were very sensible about all this. All the changes they made, all the additions were only supposed to be temporary, and they were added in a way that meant they could just be removed as soon as they needed to be without damaging the model. But no, I'm kidding. They planned to do that, but they worked out that if they tried to pull any of that off at any point, they were going to break it. So it stayed like that forever. Just reading here that apparently it was sold for auction in 2006 for $132,000 US. Wow. Number 2, Tuvok's rusty memory. Now, owing to those modifications, which they absolutely could not change, they had to build a brand new model of the Excelsior for the Voyager episode flashback. Now, just if you've not seen that episode, it's a flashback to when Tuvok was apparently on board the USS Excelsior during the events of the Undiscovered Country. It starts, it's still got that whole bit with the big shockwave through space and shields, turn him into the wave, all that bit. It's still got that in it, but then there's additional things which tell you what happened between that and them getting to everybody's rescue at the end of the film. Oh, and they also fix this thing, don't they? How he's there and then he disappears in the film, but they actually add a bit where he runs back to his console just to fix that little plot hole. It's quite clever. Now, because they had a much smaller budget and a very small time frame which to remake this ship, both the physical model of the ship and the bridge ended up being quite different to what's in the film. The ship is skinnier and has a bit more light up stuff, and the bridge model is a little bit smaller, and like I said before, it's got carpet for some reason. Also, Tuvok's there. One thing that they did, I don't know why they did this. This is Lieutenant Valtine, who in the Voyager episode, he's a major part of what happens. He gives Tuvok this brain disease, but he dies in the episode. That's a sad thing that happened. The thing is, though, at the end of the Undiscovered Country, he's there. He's alive. I get your retcon things. Why would you kill a man who's in another scene? Now, I'm saying all that, the whole point of flashback is that Tuvok has this brain disease, so it might just be that he's remembering it wrong and really Valtine's still alive, because, of course he is. He's at the whole Kitmer thing at the end of the film, so I don't know. Imagine when he gets back to the Alpha Quadrant, though, and he bumps into him, like, no way! Number 1, fictional history. Now, weirdly, Sulu being captain of the Excelsior was a thing that was written into the Wrath of Khan, but eventually taken out of that script and not fully realised until, like, the later films when he is literally captain of the Excelsior. And despite all this and the fact he got a really prominent role in the Undiscovered Country, all the adventures of the Excelsior pretty much take place off screen. Like, we hear about them cataloguing gaseous anomalies in Beta Quadrant, and then they expand on it in Voyager as they rush through that nebula and blow up them Klingons, but that's it. For such an iconic ship, for something that had such a major role in Star Trek, what did it do? We don't know. But would you like to occasionally pull from non-canon, beta-canon sources for all of this? Sulu's adventures aboard the Excelsior were part of a really cool book series called The Lost Era. It depicts the death of its original captain, Sulu taking command, all the fun stuff they get up to before the Excelsior's eventual destruction in a temporal rift at the hands of this guy from Deep Space Nine. Oh my god, it gets destroyed, Adam. Do they all die? No, it's fine. Like, they all, like Sulu and Rand and obviously Valtine because he's still alive, they all get rescued by Sulu. Just not that one. That's Sulu from the Enterprise B.
There are 10 secrets of the Danube-class runabout. Number 10. Big little ships. The Danube-class runabout was created as a way of getting the Deep Space Nine crew and the writers off the space station from time to time. As Star Trek was wont to do in those times, the first intention was to take a pre-existing model and use it for this runabout. Their first decision was to use the executive shuttle from Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, that had been designed by John Goodson and built by Industrial Light and Magic, and convert that to the runabout. This shuttle had only made a single appearance before this in Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. Now, it would turn up again in Star Trek Generations and had recently been refit in The Next Generation to become the USS Jenolan in the episode Relics. So it was considered a really good candidate as it wasn't massively familiar with the audience. Under the supervision of DS9 production designer Herman Zimmerman, illustrators Jim Martin and Rick Sternbach set to work adapting the executive shuttle to become this new runabout. The runabout cockpit set was going to be required before a miniature was required, so they retrofit the forward-sloping windows and side airlocks of the executive shuttle to fit their new runabout. As it happened, though, they actually decided not to go with the executive shuttle in the end and designed a new ship. Because work had already been locked in on this shape of the cockpit, Martin and Sternbach basically retrofit a ship around that cockpit, which eventually gave us our more recognizable Danube class. Number 9, Orinoco Flow. Early scripts for DS9 referred to these ships as runabout class vessels, but the 1994 edition of the Star Trek Encyclopedia by Michael and Denise Okuda named them Danube class. This would actually eventually be said on screen in the season 4 episode Hippocratic Oath. The Danube class designation, of course, refers to the Danube River, which is the second longest river in Europe, but also possibly refers to the Blue Danube by Johann Strauss, which featured prominently in 2001: A Space Odyssey, which had long been a go-to for Easter eggs for Star Trek. Individual runabouts were named after rivers. They were given their own USS prefix, and they were given an NCC and an individual registry. They were named like the Mekong, the Gander, the Ganges, the Orinoco, the Yangtze Kiang, the Rio Grande, and the Yukon. In production notes, it was often said that each of these runabouts might be assigned to a particular starship, or, in this case, space station. There was also an intention originally that there would be some runabouts named after alien rivers. There was a sort of an unwritten rule at the time that for every 3 names, 2 might be Earth-centric, but 1 should be alien, therefore giving the impression that the Federation was not simply comprised of Earth. Michael Piller, however, would explain that while the intention was there to name some runabouts after alien rivers, often just to include an alien river name would involve a little bit of legerdemain in the script that most of the time wasn't called for. Number 8, Cockpit Visit. The cockpit was created by set designer Joseph Hodges under the supervision of production designer Herman Zimmerman. Unlike a lot of standing sets at the time for Star Trek, this one actually contained working monitors that would allow graphics to be shown on screen. These were created by Michael and Denise Okuda and could be played live during filming. There would also be traditional backlit projections as well, aka Okudograms. There were 2 fully functioning consoles as well. One for Ops and Con, which is running the vessel completely, and then one for Tactical and Engineering. Another feature of the runabout cockpit was its ability to move. By that I mean it was constructed in such a way that it could be shifted around the set so that you could have a continuous shot in those rare times when you would see crew walking through an airlock and into the runabout itself, and vice versa. Also, it could shake when the situation called for it, when it was under attack, by which I mean you would have stagehands at either side just kind of gently vibrate the thing. It would go through a few upgrades as well throughout the years, including refinements to the transporter bay and an addition of a standard console at the back of the cockpit as well. Along the way, blast windows were added to the side of the runabout as well. That was actually for real-world practical reasons, because quite frankly, it became a bit of a pain in the hoop to try and get moving stars in these windows every time you had to film on the set. So initially they used something like beige wood paneling in the episode Whispers, before getting a more stylized airlock type covering in the episode Crossover. Like nearly every other Star Trek set, it would be redressed and reused several times for several different vessels, but we'll come to that. Number 7, time after time. While the runabouts were clearly a staple of Deep Space Nine, they did turn up from time to time in other series, most notably in the Next Generation episode Timescape. Timescape was created late in the Next Generation's run, but early in Deep Space Nine's run, so the producers took this as an opportunity to amortize some of the costs from DS9 and cover it with the Next Generation's budget. For example, while Herman Zimmerman's team built the cockpit over the course of 7 weeks, Richard James's team, which was brought in to build the aft section, which would be seen in the episode Timescape, had only 9 days to do it. It was used quite extensively in that episode and then never seen again on Deep Space Nine. Sorry, partial part of one set was seen in the episode The Visitor, but other than that, it just wasn't used, which was quite confusing as they had gone to the issue of making it. Richard James's aft compartment set did see some use in Deep Space Nine. It was redressed and used as guest quarters on the USS Prometheus in the episode Second Sight, and also in the episode Paradise was used as the interior of the SS Santa Maria. Number 6. Starship Side Piece. If we go back to the original series, remember there was a very impressive full-scale model of the USS Galileo built as a shuttle for that ship. And then after that, it became de rigueur for having shuttles built for productions. For example, Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, and of course, Star Trek The Next Generation. Deep Space Nine presented a new issue with this, because Deep Space Nine's Goddard-class shuttle, Type 6, was just over 6 meters long. However, the Danube-class runabout was said to be about 23 meters long, so frankly, they just weren't going to be building a one-to-one model of this thing. The most frequently seen exterior part of the ship that was built was the hatch that was first used in the episode Emissary for when Sisko and Jadzia are on the wormhole alien's planet, and also quite often seen attached to the docking ports of Deep Space Nine. This particular hatch is one of those things that would quite frequently be reused and redressed to become the various alien ships that would be docked at the pylons as well. A larger piece of the runabout was constructed for the Season 1 episode Battle Lines. For this, a chunk of the exterior of the USS Yangtze Kiang was built and shown crashed on this planet in the Gamma Quadrant, alongside a Type 6 shuttle's nacelle, much to the chagrin of Doug Drexler. We all knew it was wrong. We pointed it out, but the feeling was that it was general texture and the camera would never see it. Ha ha. Number 5. Convenient modular design. According to the Deep Space Nine technical manual by Herman Zimmerman, Rick Sternbach, and Doug Drexler, the Danube-class runabout was designed at Utopia Planitia shipyards in 2365. It was designed to perform rapid response, scientific expedition, transportation, and could be used as a temporary base of operations if the needed be. This role was aided by the modular design of the runabout. You had the main spine, which ran the length of the ship. Now this consisted of the 2 nacelles, the warp core, 2 impulse modules as well. There would also be the cockpit segment, the cargo bay segment in the middle, and that ever elusive aft living area as well. On top of this, there was the removable sensor bar, which was first seen in the episode Past Prologue. Now this was actually created so that there would be an easy distinction when there was a runabout chase in this episode between the Ganges and the Yangtze Kiang. Funnily enough, this led to a little bit of an issue in its only appearance in the Star Trek Voyager episode Non Sequitur. In this episode, for the bulk of the episode, the USS Yosemite is shown without the sensor bar, apart from one scene of reused footage from Deep Space Nine where the sensor bar suddenly appears. Whoops. Number 4. Padding this out. Another tidbit from the Star Trek Deep Space Nine technical manual gives us a little bit of information about the landing pads that were often shown in Deep Space Nine. These were given various names, for example, landing pad. Later on, this would be given various letters, for example, landing pad C. You would have runabout pad A, B, or C, and also there was versions of them which had numbers as well. According to the manual, Deep Space Nine housed these runabouts in various maintenance and launch bays located around the habitat ring. The living quarters around these bays were converted into engineering or ops style bays, and also anything nearby was extra padded so that they would be shielded from the noise of these runabouts taking off at every hour of the day and night. Though stock footage of a runabout taking off from that hydraulic lift would be shown throughout all 7 seasons of Deep Space Nine, the interior of the landing bay was only really shown in detail in one episode, which was the 6th season episode In the Pale Moonlight. This is when Senator Vreenek's shuttle arrives and decloaks inside the bay, and you can see a runabout behind it. Doug Drexler designed the Romulan shuttle itself, actually to resemble his pet parrot. Both the model and the landing pad were then constructed by Tony Menninger of Brazil Fabrication and Design, who created the model, the pad, and a fully working landing bay as well. Number 3. Honey, I Shrunk the Runabout. No, that's not actually a pun this time. That was the working title for the episode that would eventually go on to be called One Little Ship. You know the episode where the runabout gets shrunk down to a tiny size and then slaughters an entire contingent of Jem'Hadar warriors that had taken over the USS Defiant. You know, comedy. Funnily enough, this story had actually started as a pitch by writer Renee Echeverria for Star Trek The Next Generation that just couldn't find purchase within that series. According to scientific advisor Andrei Bormanis, the episode's science was a little bit of a stretch. For years, I'd been dreading the day the writers would decide to do some version of Fantastic Voyage. I didn't know whether I'd want to ask for a credit or a disclaimer on the episode. Despite the in-universe technical issues of shrinking a runabout, something about a subspace compression anomaly, apparently the episode was an absolute hoot to write and film. According to Terry J. Erdman and Paula Block's Star Trek Deep Space Nine companion, the way that the idea was sold to Ira Steven Behr was to construct a little model of a runabout and hang it with a fishing wire outside his window. Number 2, running gag. As we've already mentioned, sets in Star Trek just get reused and redressed all the time. It makes sense, it saves money, and of course the runabout was no exception. It got shown in some variation or another in 79 episodes of Star Trek Deep Space Nine, in that one episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, 2 episodes of Star Trek Voyager, and would also be seen in the film Star Trek Insurrection. For the opening episode of Star Trek Voyager, Caretaker, the interior of the runabout was given a major overhaul that included motion picture era backlit graphics so that it could stand in for the Valjean, the Maquis raider that Chakotay, B'Elanna and Tuvok were lost in. After this appearance, it would then go on to appear in 2 episodes of Deep Space Nine with those modifications, specifically to become a Terran raider in the episodes Through the Looking Glass and Shattered Mirror. Like that Voyager episode, this would utilise Mike Okuda's 23rd century graphic style and a lot of masking tape that made sure that it looked like, in no way, the runabout interior with a lot of masking tape all over it. Finally, the most radical redesign came for Star Trek Insurrection. At this point, it was totally repainted, the graphics were switched out, the front windows were switched out, but it's still recognisable as that runabout. As you can see, the overall shape, when you've watched as much Star Trek as we have, is a bit like, that's the Rio Grande. Number 1, survivors. Unlike Star Trek Voyager's seemingly endless supply of shuttles that, they'd blow up and be back again the next week, Deep Space Nine was fairly consistent with when something was destroyed, it stayed destroyed. Now, the problem with that is that over the 7 seasons, there were 10 named runabouts assigned to Deep Space Nine, and only 3 of them survived through to the finale. The list of named runabouts destroyed or abandoned over the course of Star Trek Deep Space Nine's run include the USS Gander, the USS Ganges, the USS Mekong, the USS Orinoco, the USS Shenandoah, the USS Yangtze Kiang, and the USS Yukon. For the record, the only 3 that survived the events of Deep Space Nine were the USS Rubicon, the USS Volga, and the USS Rio Grande, the only Danube-class runabout to make it all the way through to what you leave behind. The frequent turnover of runabouts actually caused headaches for some of the writers as the show went along. Renee Echeverria recalled trying to use the USS Ganges in a Season 7 episode, despite the fact it had been destroyed 5 years earlier in the episode Armageddon Game.